Yesterday I told you about the compromise between scientists and political power at the close of the war we call big science. This compromise has been stabilized by the constant preparedness for war the United States, Europe and the USSR continued to experience during 30 years. This period is obviously what we know by the name Cold War and had been also a kind of golden age for nuclear and particle physics alongside the space sciences that ensured spendings to continue to flow and the number of scientists involved to grow. Spendings coming from the states and from national companies. Since during this period, these countries knew a constant economic growth borne by states' protection and investments towards national industries. Eisenhower dubbed this intrication between state scientific research and industry and military goals in a famous speech in 1961 as the military-industrial complex. This led to the invention of the concept of research and development in these big national companies. The idea that we could apply the methods of organization of scientific research invented during the war to innovation for the industry, with cycles from fundamental research to industrial applications. In the United States, the most famous example was the Bell Labs, created by the monopolistic phone company AT&T. From the Bell Labs came out an impressive number of Nobel Prize in physics and breakthrough that contributed in a major way to communication technologies and material sciences. We could practically say that the modern field of condensed matter physics emerged there. To give an idea, we could name Claude Shannon, who wrote his mathematical theory of communication during the war, Arthur Schawlow and Charles Stones, who built the first laser in 1960 in parallel with the Soviet team. Penzias and Wilson, who discovered the cosmic microwave background in 1964. Or John Bardeen, William Shockley, and Waterhouse Brattain, who produced in 1947 the invention that maybe changed our second half 20th century in the most profound way, the transistor, that gave birth to the entire microelectronics. In France, the best example of this intrication between industry, fundamental physics and military goals was the creation in 1945 of the Commissariat à l'énergie atomique, the CEA, under the direction of the famous physicist Frédéric Joliot-Curie and Raoul Dautry, former minister for weaponry. The first goal of the CEA was to take over the work Joliot-Curie and his team stopped in 1939 on nuclear fission and be among the first, after the Americans, to produce a nuclear reactor thanks to controlled nuclear chain fission. This was done in 1948. In Europe, the intrication between political goals, industry and science took a specific shape with the construction of the European Union. Far from nowadays European Union, the aim was to create an intergovernmental space between the states that were opposed during the conflict, to share strategic technologies and resources, and thus ensure the end of the national rivalries that made the first half of the century. This was done with the European coal and steel community, pooling these strategic industries for war economies together, and of course with nuclear science and industry with the Euratom organization and the CERN. I won't say too much about the CERN because a lot of people in this room know far better than me this story. But I think I have set the scene to see more clearly the very special historical moment that allowed this unique project, sharing for civil uses between former enemies the science and technologies the most frightening that came out of the war. However, this compromise of the big science was a critical deal for a lot of scientists. Hiroshima had been, of course, a moral rupture for a lot of physicists. Fundamental science would no longer be considered as an only neutral and purely intellectual adventure. Fundamental science can be harmful by itself. On their side, medicine and biology had Auschwitz. Eugenics had been invented as a medical specialty with its journals and learned societies, advocating for mass sterilization for the greater good. And the trial of the Nazi doctors who enjoyed to experiment freely on humans in the extermination camps led to the Nuremberg Code in 1947, the first international text for ethics principles restricting human subject experimentations. So in the same movement, nuclear weapon became the physicist's burden. To index the freedom of physicists to decide on their research lines, on the power capacity they could give to their country starts to be a problem, when the consequences of their research can be so big and tragic. And so a lot of physicists, even those who worked on the Manhattan Project, started to join the pacifist movement and campaigned for denuclearization. Not all of them, of course. John von Neumann or Edward Teilhard became on bad terms with their former colleagues for their support to the thermonuclear bomb program. But Oppenheimer and Sakharov, the leader of the Soviet nuclear program, made their public soul searching some years after. Leo Szilard, who wrote the famous letter to Roosevelt, signed by Einstein in 1939 that led to the Manhattan Project, initiated a petition in July 1945, signed by 100 of physicists, to ask President Truman to use the bomb against Japan only if surrender discussions would not succeed. This petition was banned, but Szilard and Einstein created the year after the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists to publicly contest the development of nuclear weapons. Linus Pauling won fame, campaigning alongside Szilard and Einstein, and became finally recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1962. Joliot-Curie in France initiated the International Stockholm Appeal in 1950, calling for an international ban on nuclear weapons. He was then dismissed from the head of the CEA, and after his departure, the CEA finally engaged in the production of the French atomic bomb. I would like to mention one last important feature of this period, concerning especially particle physics. The quantitative expansion and the new way to organize big collaborations between different specialties born in the war led to an impressive diversification of subspecialties, particularly in microphysics. The historian of science Peter Gallison produced a masterful analysis of this evolution. He showed how different communities and experimental traditions came to work together in huge collaborations around big instruments like the accelerators. These subcultures can be organized around experimental, theoretical, instrument making, or data analysis goals. Each of these communities follow its own scientific aims and work in a way modeled by its own material culture, but develop communication interface with the others that Gallison dubbed trading zones, where a specific language mixing vocabularies coming from the different scientific subcultures is used. This fragmentation cooperation, very specific to contemporary physics, dissolved the very notion of the author of a scientific result, as a lot of the talks given during this conference showed. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this short trip across 20th century science could have enlightened you a bit on the strong trends inside which neutrino physics evolved and will continue to.